Hi everyone. Welcome to another session of the Chula Futures Literacy Week under the theme of connecting communities through future literacy on solidarity and transformative learning in a post-COVID-19 Asia. So this event is co-organized by Chula and the Thai National Commission of UNESCO, collaboration with partners from Asia and across the world. So good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone out there. With today's session is the Futures of Thailand book talk. We're looking at the future in 2585 Buddhist era. So that's about 20 years ahead. So this is the book written by Associate Professor Apiwat Ratanawaraha. He's also a Club of Rome full member and also a professor at the Department of Urban and Regional Planning at Chulalongkorn University. Right after his book talk, we'll also have two discussants with us today. The first one is Professor Pasuk Phongpaichit. She is a Professor Emeritus of Political Economy from the Faculty of Economics in Chulalongkorn University. And another person is Professor Yoshitsugu Hayashi. He's also the Club of Rome full member and a Professor Emeritus from Nagoya University, as well as a professor at Chubu University, Japan. I myself am the moderator for this session. My name is Ms.Wan Chantavilasvong. I'm also a lecturer at the university, at Chulalongkorn University in the urban and regional planning. I would like to let you all know that, all questions are very, very welcome. We'll have a session for your questions and answers at the end of the talk and the discussants. So if you are on Zoom, you can definitely just put up your questions through the chat. And if you're on Facebook, you can just also write in the comments or let us know what certain questions or clarifications that you want to learn more from all of these very prominent professors from both Chula and Chubu University. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce or welcome Ajahn Apiwat to take the floor, and please let us know more about the futures of Thailand in the next 20 years ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ajahn Wan. Thank you, everybody. Swadee krab. First of all, I would like to thank Ajahn Pasuk and Professor Hayashi for spending time with us today. I really appreciate your presence today. It's definitely my honor to be able to present this to both of you, as well as to other people who are listening today. The work that I'm presenting today, it's actually about the futures of Thailand in 20 years' time, like Ajahn Wan mentioned. It's actually based on a report and is now a book that we, as in I myself and Professor Ming Sam Khao Sa'at and Kun Chakri Tejawari, three of us were commissioned by the National Research Council of Thailand to write a synthesis report for a program which is called Future Thailand. And that program has 10 projects ranging from socio-economic issues to political economy and politics of Thailand in the next 20 years. And collect some more data and talk to a number of people, and then come up with this book, which is called Anakot Pratet Thai 2585, which is the Futures of Thailand 2585 BE. So the way I would like to start this talk today is just to contrast two different worlds. One is a lot of us know that we live in a very volatile uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world at this moment. And we know what's going on in Ukraine, so you know what it is like to live in a VUCA world. But unfortunately, the assumptions that we use a lot of time in our policy making, particularly for long-term policies for Thailand in particular, we tend to have these assumptions about stability, certainty, simplicity, and clarity. So the gap between the reality of the VUCA world and the policy assumptions that we use in policymaking make a lot of problems and create some risk for not just for the country as a whole, but the risk at the systemic level for the individuals, for households, and for the communities in Thailand, and perhaps beyond. But the idea of looking into the future does have some principles that we can follow. We, in this study, we use the concept that we site. Basically, the idea here is that in the future, there are many different kinds of futures, ranging from the projected future, which is based on something that we are relatively certain about, to some plausible future, which has a lower probability, as well as the wild cards. We know that they could happen, but we don't know exactly when they are going to happen, and we don't know the potential impacts of when they happen. And then we will create some scenarios based on the plausibility of different types of futures that we can forecast. So in this regard, we in our study, we try to basically move from just do some early warnings. I mean, future studies has a lot of benefits. One, future studies or foresight could actually serve as early warnings for the people in the country, in the community, and in the system. And then we can forecast the alternative futures, what kinds of futures could actually happen in the time frame that we are interested in. But another important feature or advantage of future studies is actually to create new narratives that could get us out from the current status, the status quo that we are sort of stuck in. So in this book, our team actually organized the content into four sections. The first one is about what's going on in Thailand today. And then we look at how the structure in the society and the economy and a little bit of the politics have changed over time. And then we look at the drivers of change, what the factors really contribute to the changes that we see, and use the drivers of change as a way to think about what potential or plausible alternative futures we can imagine. So based on that, I would like to give you a quick overview about what's happening in Thailand today. Sorry if you're definitely much more of an expert than I am, but this is sort of a quick overview of Thailand. We know that the Thai economy has not been doing so well in the past 10 years at least. It's been slow growth that we have experienced, possibly stagnant. And one would wonder if we are actually declining. Perhaps not in absolute term, but at least in the relative term. According to a study by PricewaterhouseCoopers, even though Thailand is third among 6 ASEAN countries, including Vietnam, our growth is the lowest among the 6 countries. And it is expected that in 20 years' time, Vietnam and potentially the Philippines will overtake Thailand in terms of the economy. Even though at this moment, GDP per capita is relatively stable in terms of ranking, global ranking, and the Global Innovation Index suggests that we're not doing too bad, as well as Human Development Index. We are actually improving in that regard. But there are other indices that show that Thailand is not doing so well in the past at least 5 years. Competitiveness is lagging behind other emerging countries, and people are not that happy, apparently. The ranking here has gone down. And we all know that corruption is everywhere in Thai society. But we try to find the bright spots a little bit here and there. Apparently, even though in general, the previous index showed that Thailand is not very happy. Thai people are not very happy. But at least in terms of just in ASEAN, in this ranking, we are second only to Singapore. And in terms of World Giving Index, from the index, it shows that we are quite generous people in terms of charity. So perhaps these are good bright spots. But in order to think about the future, we do need to look at how things have changed over time, at least in the past 10 to 20 years. Again, a gloomy picture. Agriculture used to be Thailand's pillar of the economy. We were top 3 in several crop markets, particularly rice. But a lot of policies in the past 10, 20 years have actually reduced Thailand's competitiveness in several crop markets. Particularly, for example, rice variety improvement has been too slow for changing demand. Other fruits, for example, may be doing well, say durian, but in terms of productivity, we're not that great. One big factor that I think Professor Hayashi may relate, because it's similar to the case of Japan, aging farmers, and this is a serious issue in the agricultural sector in Thailand. The rural households have been reliant heavily on remittances, not just from the cities, but also from overseas. So it's critical for Thailand at the moment to think about the future of the agricultural sector. Are we going for larger farms? Are we going into smart farming, niche farming? These are the key issues that we need to explore. But manufacturing used to be the engine for economic growth for Thailand in the past 40 years. But from what we have reviewed, we are probably stuck in the middle productivity trap, not just in terms of middle income trap, but also manufacturing itself is not doing so well. Now, that is not applicable to some large firms. Some large firms are growing quite well. They have access to new technologies. They have improved their export markets, and they're quite competitive. But that's only within some large firms. There are a lot of firms that are left behind. So we have some market power problems here. And the Thai manufacturing has been relying primarily on the global production chains. We have not been able to lead in the global market in terms of industrial productivity and development. And lately, due to some political, economic factors, domestic investment has decreased. Now, if we look at this industry rankings, and this is a global ranking, some sectors in Thailand are doing relatively okay. Coal production, oil refinery, rubber and plastics, and even in food and beverages are doing okay. But as you know, these are older traditional technologies. But if we think ahead into the future, which is going to be based on knowledge and innovation and technology, Thailand is definitely lagging behind in terms of education, in terms of IT. In these industries, we're not doing so well. Now, tourism has actually been a savior of the Thai economy in the past 10, 20 years, particularly before COVID. But because of that, we have relied too much on tourism, and that has created some over-reliance problem for Thailand. Not only that, it might have created some problem because we rely too much and put all the eggs into basically in the tourism sector. So we are facing some problems here. But we also face the issue of over-tourism, which led to environmental degradation in several spots throughout the country, particularly popular spots in Phuket, for example, and that's certainly before COVID. But also in the city, gentrification is happening everywhere. That has led to the rise of land costs and housing costs that create problems for the local who cannot afford to live close to their jobs in the city because tourism has gentrified those city centers. But at the same time, global tourism is changing rapidly. We are already entering the post-industrial lifestyle era where people no longer work 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. We know that during COVID, we can work from home or work from everywhere. So tourism will also change according to the changing lifestyle. So we need to think in terms of how this demand is going to change. Unfortunately, local operators, a lot of them still rely on mass tourism, particularly from China, and we have very limited efforts in transforming digitally. So this has created some long-term challenges for the Thai tourism industry. In terms of policy, even though a lot of agencies are trying to upgrade the industries here, putting a lot of effort in knowledge-based industries and innovation, but a lot of investment, particularly in terms of infrastructure development, the money has been poured into the old model of industrial development, which is the Eastern Economic Corridor. And we don't know if this is going to be really successful, but a lot of money has been put into that. The Thai state is problematic because we hope that the state would be helping and supporting the Thai economy to move forward. But unfortunately, we know that it's become a big hindrance. Bigger government, but even though in terms of public infrastructure and poverty alleviation, according to some studies that we reviewed, we've done not too bad, but they're not very efficient and they're not future ready. We're not preparing the country for the future. Governance, I'm certainly not an expert, but we generally know that corruption is everywhere. Decentralization used to was going quite well before the coup, but that has gone through a U-turn. A lot of power has now been reconcentrated in the ministries and agencies in Bangkok. From our review, we can call it a Thai-style democracy, if there's really a democracy in this country. But interestingly, we see in the past couple of years increasing demand for liberal democracy from younger generations of people in Thailand. So in terms of the baseline that we see, these are the key issues that we think will be the key issues for Thailand. But this is the baseline. This is what we see will definitely happen. They are relatively certain, aging society, disruptive technologies, platform economy, but we also know certain bombs, certain issues are ticking time bombs, like, ballooning household debt, for example, inequality as well. We know that climate change is a really, really a big challenge for Thailand, and it's around the corner. In terms of politics, it's no longer a wild card. Yeah, this is a wild normal, right? I mean, geopolitical issues, as well as the generational conflicts that we see that's happening here. So to sum up the overview, Thailand today, basically low growth, high inequality or inequity, and high systemic risk. The part about the future is what we think would be an interesting contribution from this report. Because nobody knows the future. Nobody has the fact about the future. So the only thing we can do is really to basically use the information and knowledge a little bit of the past and the present to imagine about the future. But we know that long-term future is definitely uncertain. So what we can do, though, is to actually come up with alternative pictures of the future, or what we call scenarios. And because it's almost like a coin when we flip. Even though we don't know which one is going to happen, at least we know the alternative futures that we can at least plan for, and we come up with the options. But another objective of this report or this book is actually not just to review and forecast about the future. We're definitely not fortune tellers there, but we also want to change mainstream thinking, the current ways of thinking and the current ways of doing. Because even though somebody asked us, like, if things are good already, why do we need to challenge them? It's because in future studies, we think that even though certain things are good now, the context, the conditions, and the constraints may change over time. So we need to think out of the box so that we could create some new narratives to find new opportunities and perhaps the solution. And it's also related to the concept of risk that we use for our study. In order to think into the future, we cannot just avoid and reduce the risk, but also in finding opportunities and take the opportunities, we need to take some risk as well. So risk is both things that we need to avoid and things that we need to actually take so that we can move forward into the future. So the content of the book and what I'm going to present in a little while, we aim to be thought-provoking. Some of them could actually be quite controversial, but we really want to create and generate dialogues among people with different and diverse ideas and interests. And hopefully people will use our book as a way to discuss about alternative futures of Thailand. The method that we use in our study, we use two methods here. One is a mainstream popular method of scenario building, which is called the 2x2 matrix scenario building method. It's quite simple. We identify two drivers of change with high impact and high uncertainty, and then create two polar opposites of the two drivers. So we have two drivers, two opposites, and we just cross them. Once we cross them, then we would have four scenarios. For this one, we focus on what could be happening in the year 2585 or 2040. And then we use another method called branching scenarios, which is basically help us think about the pathways from the current time today and look into the future towards the preferable scenario that we want. But we add key events and turning points and some conditions that we think will be important for each pathway. And these key events will serve as the strategic options that we should consider as we look into the future. In order to think about the future, we need some sort of context and challenges to frame our thinking. And in this study, we have 3 grand challenges for Thailand in the next 20 years, if not longer. We know that climate change, climate calamity is around the corner. That's definitely almost the biggest one because it's almost at the global level and humanity level. But we also consider disruptive technology, technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotic automation, synthetic biology. Those are foundational technologies that could disrupt the economy at the global level, as well as in Thailand. And the context here is that Thailand is not at the forefront of technological development. So we will be disrupted drastically by what's going on at the global level. Now, what is also important, and we consider this a chronic stress for Thailand, which is inequality and inequity. When we think about the future and in terms of risk, we think in terms of both chronic stress that comes from the change of the climate as well as inequality, but there are also the shocks that could come from climate disruptions and disruptive technologies. So these are the 3 challenges that frame our thinking. The first driver that we use as the scenario logics in our study. The first one is growth type. It's pretty straightforward. I think we all know that Thailand has been relying too much on what we call brown growth, basically extraction and exploitation of not only natural resources, but also human resources, social capital, those kinds of things. So we know that those are the old sources of wealth that Thailand has been relying on. They are extractive, exclusive, and grabbing. Now, the other opposite of this model of the growth type is green growth. We know that we want the new sources of wealth that come from regenerative industries that are inclusive of different stakeholders and groups of people in society, which is based on sharing not only the resources, but the wealth generated by growth. So this is one driver that we use. The other driver, this is a little bit more political economy here. It's about the power of governance over resources, who govern the resources that contribute to wealth and growth and well-being of the people in Thai society. Now, one opposite is a centralized governance, which is relatively closer to what's going on in Thailand now. The other extreme is distributed governance pattern. Now we have, because we talk to a lot of people who think that decentralization is important for Thailand, but a lot of people, when we talk about decentralization here, we often think of decentralization to local governments. But in our thinking about the future, we want to make sure that we're not just talking about decentralization to local governments, but also distribution of governance to different networks of people, of different groups in society. So this is how we frame our scenario here. So once we have that, we have the 2x2 metrics, and then we come up with the 4 scenarios here. As you can see, on the left is brown growth, on the right is green growth, and on the vertical axis, centralized governance at the bottom and distributed governance at the top. So with that, we come up with 4 scenarios. We I would like to actually thank a lot of reviewers and a lot of people who gave us comments and feedback. We originally had a different titles or names of the scenarios, but now we finalized it to these four. The first one, lower left, here. With brown growth and centralized governance, we call this scenario millipedes in the maze. Imagine millipedes. They go very slow. They may not be able to get out of the maze or the labyrinth that we are stuck in. The second scenario is called eels out of the mud. Basically, we still kind of stuck in brown growth, obviously, because it's not sustainable. But at least we get out of the mud, because in this situation we have experienced decentralization a little bit, because the governance has become more distributed among different groups in society, different cities, different provinces as well. So that's the second. The third, organic chickens in the high-tech coop. This is the situation where we are able to get into the green growth situation with some big investment, but the governance of the resources is still very centralized to certain groups of people. The fourth one, I will give the details in a little bit as well. The fourth one is doves beyond borders. We think this is closest to the preferable or the ideal future for Thailand, where the country and the individuals have developed into green growth. The sources of wealth are from the green economy, and the distribution of power is wide and inclusive, such that we are free. So these are the general picture of the scenarios. I would like to spend a little bit more time to explain the details of each scenario. I won't be able to go into all the details. For those of you who can read Thai, it would be great if you could read them and give us some feedback. But the first scenario, millipedes in the maze, this is what we think. It's not so different from today in Thailand, and it could actually be worse. One thing that we think that could happen to Thailand is that even in 20 years' time, Thailand could be called Argentina of the East. We know that Argentina at one point was a very, very prosperous country, but it got stuck, not only in terms of the economy, but also in politics and different things. Basically, didn't allow Argentina to become a developed economy. We don't like Thailand to have to be stuck like that, but in this scenario, Thailand could be Argentina of the East. The economy will lagging behind other countries in ASEAN, obviously to Vietnam. In this scenario, a sustainable consumption and production will not happen widely, maybe in limited areas of Thailand. We know that rail transit systems are being developed in Bangkok, so we could be okay, but maybe just limited to Bangkok. But so many other people live elsewhere in the country. Infrastructure is not going to be sustainable in this scenario. In terms of political economy, we think that in this scenario, with the centralized governance system and with the brown economy, we are going to be stuck in the hierarchical market economy with centralized oligarchy. The elites and capital groups in Bangkok will probably join hands with global platforms and dominate the Thai economy and Thai life. Greater productivity will definitely happen among large firms because they have access to technologies and capital, but not to SMEs, small, medium enterprises, not to mention labor. So in this scenario, we will see a shrinking middle class, college grads will become, quote unquote, the useless class. They cannot find jobs. They cannot find good livelihoods. Bangkok will continue to exploit resources from the rest of the country, and we see segregation everywhere. So in this scenario, we think this is a very high systemic risk situation, not just for the individuals, but for the country as a whole. The second scenario, when we get out of the mud a little bit, in this scenario, because of decentralization, local economy will thrive. But because of the lack of investment in green infrastructure in the provinces, even though the local economy may thrive, but it's still not sustainable. We still probably rely on the old models of economic development, even though the provinces, cities in the provinces may grow a little bit. Unsustainable consumption and production, mostly in smaller cities and smaller towns. And in terms of political economy, we still think that in this situation, hierarchical market economy would still be the structure of the political economy of Thailand, even though it may be decentralized a little bit to the provincial elites, provincial capitalists, who may join hands with investors from China to compete against groups from Bangkok. Definitely in this situation, local governments will become more powerful and they create some strong national networks. In this situation, as you can see, it's different from the first one, where even though it's not sustainable in terms of production and consumption, the power is spread more to the rest of the country. So in some aspects, inequality actually decreased, for example, between Bangkok and the rest. But in other aspects, inequality could increase, for example, between big cities and small cities. So in this regard, we think that in this scenario, the systemic risks are probably lower than the previous one, but growth is probably quite modest because we're not shifting to the new source of wealth, which is in a green and circular economy. The third one is when we are able to move to the green and circular economy, but driven primarily by large firms who have access to the technologies, mostly from overseas. We could get into sustainable consumption and production, primarily because there's large investment in renewable energy, sustainable infrastructure, and buildings. So we see that in this case, we probably see some competition among new firms and old firms. Some new firms are able to get into new businesses based on the green economy. Some old firms are lagging behind. But even in this situation, the market is still dominated by large firms who have access to the new technology and capital. So we call the situation green oligarchy, meaning it's still oligarchs controlling the country, but they are quote unquote green. In this case, China is probably a big player in Thailand because China has a lot of new technologies in the green businesses as well as capital that they are willing to invest in Thailand. In this situation, we see that there will be all the new types of inequality happening throughout the country. We see the rise of the green class and the fall of the brown class, who are still stuck in the old model of production and wealth. In this case, high growth driven by large firms, but there's still some systemic social political risk because of inequality. The last one, which is sort of the preferable, the target future for us, is when we can really go into full-scale green economy, but inclusive. So we see smart infrastructure, sustainable infrastructure everywhere, down to the level of microgrid of energy production, for example. Each community has its own way of producing its own renewable energy. So in this case, ideally, sustainable consumption as well as production, but there's also change among the Thai people in terms of their habit. Reduce, reuse, recycle, the three R's would be, prevalent in Thailand. Everywhere, we see sustainable production and consumption. In this particular case, because we think that the wealth is spread, it requires some coordination among different sectors in the economy and society. So we call this coordinated market economy, where there's regular continuous negotiation and deliberation among the labor, capital, the state, communities. Basically, it's a continuous negotiation and coordination among different groups in Thai society. So in this case, we hope that in this scenario, there's some sort of green social contract, the new social contract that's based on the green economy with the new types of welfare systems, for example, perhaps universal basic income schemes. With these, we hope that Thailand will be able to generate high growth, lower inequity, and overall lower systemic risk. Now, this is the summary of the future in 20 years' time. We know that we're sort of here. We want to get there to the preferable future. But in order to get there, we face key policy challenges. One challenge is what people in resource economics and certainly, the Club of Rome has been forefront in this conversation, which is basically about decoupling between economic growth and resource use. We still want growth. We still want the economy to grow. But how can we grow with less resources? That is a key challenge of decoupling, the first one. But the second important challenge is what we call productivity, the decoupling between productivity and wage. We know that artificial intelligence, robotics, and other new technologies will definitely increase productivity. But because of that, firms may not want to increase wage. So you will see the gap or decoupling between rising productivity and stagnant or lower real wages because of the technology. So those are what I call double decoupling. But we also face the dilemma here in terms of policy making and policy implementation. We want Thailand to transform at the structural level from the economy, society, politics, human settlements, the environment, everything. We require some structural transformation. But structural transformation requires some urgency and top-down action. But at the same time, we want the transformation or the transition to be just as well. We want it to be inclusive. We want it to be just. So we face this dilemma of urgency that demands top-down action and prudence and deliberation that requires bottom-up process. So we are facing with this. So with this in mind, we have come up with the future pathways of Thailand. As I mentioned earlier, the second method of scenario building is basically looking at the way the future could diverge in Thai society. So I'm going to wrap up pretty soon, sorry. So we have here, Thailand at this moment, around here. This is closest to us at the moment. We are the millipedes in the maze, but we want to get there. We want to get there. So there are four paths to our future. Are we gonna get worse and face the Thai tragedy? Are we going to decentralize first and then invest in green infrastructure and economy, which what we call the decentralized before green pathway? Or we are gonna invest in green infrastructure and then build the wealth later? Or we are just gonna go straight to the Thai transformation so that we can achieve our goals. So these are the 4 pathways that could happen here in Thailand. So, excuse me, I'm stuck. So the pathways that we see, excuse me, there's some problem with my slides. Okay, the first the Thai tragedy, and I'm trying to wrap up here quickly. We think that one necessary condition for all pathways of Thailand is that the elites have to relent and compromise with diverse requests. Otherwise, we will get stuck and we will get worse. In the short run, somebody may win, some people may win, but and others lose. But in the long run, because of the climate and because of the continuous turbulent economy and conflicts, everybody will lose. If we decentralize before green, we need some big bang decentralization. And even though we focus first on public administration to decentralize, we have to build advocacy networks covering different diverse groups of people in society so that we create the governance that's called network governance, not state governance, not market governance, but network governance. Once we have that, we co-invest in green infrastructure so that we can move from the situation of eels to the situation of doves. In this case, we need local governments to get stronger. We need labor unions, and we need new cooperative models for Thailand. The third one, which is the one that the private sector invests a lot in the green infrastructure. We call it the Thai Green New Deal. This requires a lot of money and a lot of effort from the private sector because the government doesn't have enough money for the Green New Deal. So we require public-private partnerships led by the private sector. But we also are concerned that because we don't have the technologies, a superpower such as China will play a big role in this process of green transition. So that's why we need antitrust and competition laws, as well as some fair trade movements among the middle class and the producers who would resist, who would go up against large firms so that the market power of large firms will be reduced. Otherwise, we will have what I mentioned earlier, the green oligarchy. In this case, we may need a wild card such as the Thai Green Party, like in the case of Germany. The fourth one, and this is the last pathway, we want to just go straight, even though it's going to be high costs, perhaps this is the highest return. We want all reforms in all sectors, from public administration, the military, the police, justice system. But in addition to that, we need some reform of the basic welfare systems, not only just in terms of health, because in terms of health, Thailand is not doing too bad, but in terms of housing, transportation, education, and everything. The wild card here definitely is universal basic income. We probably need something like that to reduce systemic risk faced by individuals and communities. So this is my last slide. In our book, at the end of the book, we actually propose that there are 2 core principles for a resilient Thailand that will allow us to avoid and reduce some systemic risk and to allow us to rebound faster, which is resilience. We need diversity in the society. So our strategies need to make sure that we keep and increase diversity in this society, not just in terms of the society, but also the economy, in terms of spatial development, in terms of the culture. We need diversity, but diversity alone is not enough. We need justice as well in terms of not only distributive justice of the outcome of the resources, but also in terms of procedural justice. We have to make the process fair and democratic. we have 4 strategies that we proposed. I'm not going into the detail much, but just want to say that we stress that all these strategies point to the importance of diversity and justice in Thai society. Thank you very much for your patience, and sorry I took a little bit of too much time. ขอบคุณครับ
All right. Thank you so much, Dr.Apiwat, for your very interesting book. I'm very excited to read it in full. Let's move on to our discussants. Let's have Professor Pasuk Phongpaichit, the Professor Emeritus of Political Economy at the Faculty of Economics at Chulalongkorn University, be the first to kind of discuss upon the book itself and the presentation that Ajahn Apiwat has just given. Please, Ajahn Pasuk, are you available to turn on your camera? Yes.
Yes.
Hello, สวัสดีค่ะ
สวัสดีค่ะ So I have about 15 minutes comment, okay? And I will read my comments. First of all, thank you so much for inviting me to participate in this fascinating Chula Futures Literary Week. I'm excited to see this very ambitious book on Thailand futures, funded by the National Research Council of Thailand. Around the world, there is increased interest in studying the future because of the rapid buildup of new risks and challenges. Health risks, global warming, geopolitical tensions, and institutional breakdown. But in Thailand, this book of the future is particularly important because of what happened over the last decade. After the 2014 coup, the government spent huge resources on a 20-year strategic plan. This was a great opportunity, of course, but the result is a great disappointment. The core theme of the 20-year plan is centralized, top-down, overall resources, and all decision-making. This is very sad. Over the past generation, the quality of Thailand's human resources have improved enormously through investments in education, cheaper travel, and better access to information through digital technologies. But the government has no faith in the people. It often sees them as threats, as if people are the enemy. So it compiled this 20-year plan through a very narrow process. The result reflects the mentality of officialdom and ignores the talents and aspiration of the people. As the book notes, if you read, there is a risk that this 20-year strategic plan will become, in their words, an iron cage that will restrict the country's chances of prospering. So I am so relieved and excited to see this ambitious book, which hopes to stimulate debate and discussion among as many people as possible. I would say bravo to the team. In the short time available today, I will do 3 things. First, highlight the book themes of the present situation, which I find most important. Second, highlight themes in the book's vision of the future, which I find most crucial and exciting. Lastly, I will make some short comments on driving this project forward to the next stage. First, on the book's analysis of Thailand's present situation, I want to flag 4 themes. 1, the strategy of over-centralization. Thailand's government was very centralized in the past, as we know, but this began to change in the late 20th century. Then following the coups in 2006 and 2014, there has been a return to centralization with a vengeance. Local government has been gutted. Mechanism for popular participation in evaluating infrastructure projects have been set aside. the media and civil organizations which express and activate the opinions of the many are under attack. Power is concentrated in a small governing clique, especially in the office of the Prime Minister and in the use of special and emergency powers. Second, the suffocating grip of big capital everywhere, in industry, real estate, infrastructure, retail, and also in the green economy, which this book highlights as important for the future of Thailand. The Thai Army has signed an agreement with the Electricity Generating Authority of Thailand to produce solar energy on 0.7 million hectares of government land under the Thai Army's control. Meanwhile, it is rather difficult for households, communities, and small businesses to invest in solar energy as a business or for their own use, as we all know. This is a pattern we see time and again now. Systems are set up to favor a very small number of big companies with links to those in power. Ultimately, this consistent bias limits the opportunities available to everyone else, especially to SMEs. It depresses growth and contributes to inequality. Third, the resurgence of corruption. The book points to the decline in Thailand's performance on the Transparency International Index, but there are many indicators, and we should not be surprised. The best limitation on corrupt behavior is the ability of the people to monitor those in power, to blow the whistles, and to get corrupt people punished. Authoritarianism always breeds corruption. We should not be surprised. Powerful people tainted with corruption get away with it time after time. Everyone can see this, and it cultivates a mixture of cynicism, despair, and reluctant tolerance. Fourth, the general decline in the quality of the administration of the country at all levels. Thailand has become a much more complex society over the last few decades, but there has been little upgrading of the bureaucratic structure. The delivery of public services has failed to keep pace with the growth of the society, prosperity, and complexity. In part, this is due to corruption, but even more to the inefficient, unfair, and inadequate taxation system, or to put it bluntly, the unwillingness of the rich to pay for their fair share, and the government's lack of political will to go ahead with tax reform. Now, let me look at the book's Mapping of the Future, something to look forward to. It covers a very wide range of issues and others, and offers multiple scenarios. But let me just cherry pick some points that I find most significant. First is the overwhelming need to decentralize power and create flexible structures which enable people to contribute to social outcomes, as the book tried to emphasize. There is plenty of evidence of the reserves of skill, energy, and public spirit. Tham Luang Cave Rescue is a brilliant example used in the book, but all around the country, there are attempts by community and civic groups to contribute to economic growth and social well-being. But also, there is enormous frustration at the unnecessary barriers to many of these attempts at many local levels. In the last few years, I and my research team have been studying land governance, the laws and institutions which determine who has access to land and how it can be used. Our study shows that, amazingly, 60% of all the country's land is still controlled by government, and that the disputes over the use of forests and public land, which emerged at the end of the Cold War, have not progressed to any kind of solution over the last 3 decades. This is a prime example of how the concentration and centralization of power results in suboptimal use of resource and a lot of unnecessary heartache. The solution must be decentralization and broader political space to allow people to negotiate local solutions. There are already examples of local communities working with local governments and the local authority, like the Forestry Department, to solve disputes peacefully. But there needs to be a system to give official recognition to such agreements and to make them more widespread, like what happened to the land situation in China around the 1970s. Second, the need to pursue green growth, not brown. The book cleverly constructs a definition of green growth, which means not only environmentally friendly, but also oriented to the new digital technologies, dispersed rather than centralized, and equalizing rather than disequalizing. The book notes that tourism, on which Thailand had become overly dependent before the pandemic, is actually brown, not green. But how to move forward towards green growth? This is a much more difficult question. When we have a prime minister who ended a major speech on the threat of climate change by announcing a new coal-fired generation project, we must admit we have a long way to go. Third, the book puts a heavy emphasis on the principle of justice, including distributive and procedural justice in all dimensions regarding decisions over resource and just transition, which is very important. I agree entirely. I would like to flag the special importance of the judiciary reform. With the growth in the complexity of the economy and society, the courts have become more important as means to resolve disputes and to ensure social justice. But the judicial system is problematic. The system is slow and inefficient. Access is very uneven. The involvement of the higher courts in political disputes has damaged trust in the system as a whole. And the judiciary is very averse to any criticism of reform. This is a major problem. Now, lastly, let me make a few comments on pushing this wonderful project to the next stage. These comments may seem a bit critical, but the aim is to be helpful. I'm a fan of the team. First, the presentation style. The author states that this report aims to be a starting point for discussion and exchange among diverse groups to jointly find a way forward. That is great. The report offers several scenarios for the future and decorates them with jolly titles like Millipedes in the Maze, designed to attract attention. That's great too. But I wonder if the framework of multiple scenarios and pathway is too complex to command attention. Perhaps it needs to be refined into something simpler to engage the mass of the people in any kind of debate. Anyway, this is just an observation. Second, paying attention to the new generation. The expectations of Thailand young people have turned in new directions far removed from what older generation understand. The dreams and energies of the young have enormous potential to drive change and Thailand transformation. Managing this potential is not easy, but it must be done. Third, looking for help elsewhere. In Europe, study of the future is well advanced. The current trend is to stress local research and participation. This stems from the realization that each locality is different and that local people often have the best idea of what needs to be done, but not the best data. Governments have launched programs of data gathering on risks, challenges, and technical aspects of new things to come, while also commissioning local research on solutions. This is what's happening everywhere in Europe. This is very relevant to our situation. Basic data at the local level is still very patchy. Recently, the UN has had difficulty in monitoring the SDG in Thailand. The IPCC projections of the climate change impact in Thailand has the same problem. No local data or very inadequate. When Thailand launched into modern industrial development in the 1950s, it started by setting up a range of new institutions and collecting a slew of new data all over the country. Something equivalent is needed now. I strongly hope that the National Research Council of Thailand will fund the collection of necessary technical and local data needed for the plans and pathways laid out in this study and do it generously. I hope too that the NRCT will involve local people and organizations in the next stages of research and planning, not only because they can identify where the problem really lies, and because they already have the ideas on what should be done, but because this will create a feeling of being part of the process of change for the better. Lastly, I would just like to mention politics. Which of the scenarios and pathways that Thailand travel down will largely be determined by who has the power to take the major decisions. And that in turn depends on what kind of constitution we have and how we vote. We should never forget that these fundamental things still apply. Finally, many congratulations on the extraordinary book. I hope it will have the impact that it really fully deserves. I like it very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Ajahn Pasuk. Your summary as well as the sort of critical review of the book is very, very helpful, and in seeing the larger picture as well as, you know, seeing the hope in going forward. So next up, we have Hayashi Sensei. He actually has worked in some of the projects in Thailand. So I have heard that you are quite familiar with Bangkok and Thailand itself. So please go ahead with your discussions and points. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your really generous introduction of myself. And I am really fascinated by the whole way of thinking of Professor Apiwat. Well, really, I'm honored to be invited. Thank you very much to this very important event. I would like to give some comments. The first one is immunity. You mentioned immunity has the word immunity has become very popular after we have found that we are in the pandemic. So that is very important to be prepared for unexpected crisis. So that is really important. Professor Apiwat has talked about many weak points of Thailand or Bangkok now, but I have found a very strong point. The very good one is Thailand 4.0, mentioning very simply the age era has become to change from the day of people for economy to economy for people. That's excellent. That is the best wording of the country's goal compared to German industry 4.0 or Japanese society 5.0. Japanese 5.0, if I may to criticize, is where the innovation, technological innovation will bring us happiness. Well, that's not. Okay. But Thailand 4.0 definition is really universal and general. I like it very much. So everywhere I cite the word in my presentation, everywhere in the world. So you told about that large companies are dominant in economy, and then they are very much growing, and then country's economy has been driven by big companies, and the small entrepreneurs have not been grown. That's very similar to the Japanese situation after 1990. You may or may not know that the latter half of 1980s, Japan had the day of so-called bubble economy. Okay. And the total land asset of whole Japanese territory is double of that of America, US. America's territory, physical territory, is 25 times bigger than Japan. So that means per square meter, 50 times more value the Japanese land has. Well, that's totally, totally wrong. But the majority of Japanese believed it. So that's very bad. And then the Japanese have been satisfied, and then have happened nothing since then. When I was a child, many years ago, Japanese products were cheap, but very much likely to be broken easily. That's why we should buy German instruments, etc., or Swiss watch. But since then, that was around 1960, Japanese industries have been, developing themselves, and then, accumulated the original ideas. And then, in some aspects, Japanese industries have become very competitive. So that's a very good hint for today's Thailand and today's Japan as well. That is one thing. I will show you later a little bit slides. I have corrected some slides, but I could not forecast what Professor Apiwat will speak about. Then very much rubbish slides, but I will show you a bit later. And then as for the economy, you told was really although you told many sectors or industries have lost the position in ASEAN countries or in the world. but also you mentioned about the important bright spots. That is the individual community network. That is very important. And I will show you a little bit also some slides about this. So today, many say conflicts, wars, that's very, very bad. And before that, Western way of thinking centered 20th century civilization have really broken the basic, say, human and ecological system. That's true. And that is written in the book Come On. So that is the Club of Rome 50th anniversary report. After 50 years, this year is the 50th anniversary of the first report, the limits to growth. So it is written by Western members. So we have broken the system. Okay. So what is missing is, or they have lost, is the people's, say, local communities, mutual affections. That is very important, and very fortunately, in many places in Thailand, you still have. I'm not really sure in Bangkok, it's too big. We should be very careful, though. That is a very important point. So that is one of the signs for the Thailand to create her own socio-economic or ecological system. That is local people's affections. But related to that, and also bubble economy, Japan also had experiences skyrocketing land price, I told. But it was coming from, say, unreasonable, unscientific forecast, okay, as I told. So that means in the future planning, we have to be, say, cool. Okay, so there are no many other scientific evidences than demographic forecast. So Thailand will start population decline and the aging, maybe already starting. Well, Japan started population decline in 2005. So until then, some researchers, scientists forecasted, but for 99% of Japanese people did not wish to believe it. Okay. Then when really starting decline, in NHK News, they reported, then people recognize. So that's another learning. That is, well, going back to the Club of Rome first report, the limits to growth, many, say, indicative signs there. So most impressed was this kind of story. So if someone goes to a pond nearby, near his house, her house, and there's a water lily, lotus water lily there, one leaf. The leaf grows every day twice. Okay, so the second day, two pieces of two leaves. Okay, the third day, so that guy, or three, no, because each will be doubled. So the four. Okay, so 29th day, half of the pond is covered by water lily leaves. That guy did not recognize that was the last day. And then the 30th day, everything ended. So that's a very, very educational and indicative story. So please start recognize population decline and aging society. So when I went to Regent Park together with my doctor mentor about 30 years ago, Yoshi, okay, my name is Yoshi. Japan will become like this. So what we observed is there were many elderly people sitting on the benches, and then ducks or some other animals are there, do nothing, and just observing the animals. Okay, I could not imagine the future. But that happened, or happening already, has happened in Japan. So very unfortunately, the history will be repeated. It's like coronavirus that cannot be stopped at the border. Okay, so you will be infected very soon. So, and then Apiwat Sensei told about restorative and inclusive development. I like these words very much. That is, I already talked about this, the family or local communities affections. But that is also should be equipped by the commercial companies. It's about 30 years ago, again in Japan. So Japanese companies, president salary was about 8 times than the freshman at that time. So I read some article about 30 years ago. Okay. And America more than 100 times. Okay. So that means good times the Japanese companies, because I hope still continuing, the company members think we are all family members in a good sense. So, and even the canteen, restaurant for lunch, the same room, same restaurant for the president, for the newcomers, eat together and then talk. Very unfortunately, say black companies now, or they are not called black, but many companies are looking at shareholders, okay? Not the workers there, even, or even the families of workers. So I believe Thai companies have kept still many of them are keeping such kind of spirit and mind. So that is another very much appealing point and merit for your society. So that should be kept. And then like ESG investment, that was driven by the Westerns.
Excuse me.
Okay, I will stop. Yes, soon. Okay.
You have about 5 minutes left,
yes, okay,
but
okay.
if you want to wrap
okay.
up.
Thank you. This is the final comments. Okay. So if we watch and the companies are not, say, thinking about the members, then the stock value will be depreciated. So such kind of market we have to create. Okay, thank you. And then finally, I will talk in the discussion time. We will seek for the society or decentralize the society with local autonomy. That is the first one. And then we have to prepare or create now inheritable city, or including sustainable and resilient, inheritable, okay? Confident to the next generation. Okay? And finally, if we have such soft and hardware both, then we will start shrinking, good shrinking, smart shrinking, or gathering. Thank you, that's all.
Thank you so much, Professor Hayashi. Wow. So thank everyone. So including Dr. Apiwat, Ajahn Pasuk, and Professor Hayashi. So this is a very, very interesting talk and discussions. I've picked up so many interesting points. Some of them includes, Ajahn Pasuk has already summarized most of it. It's looking at the present moment, seeing where the problems are. And you also point out the fact that the judiciaries is also part of the critical point in turning Thailand towards the future, given the current state of our government today. And going forward, we also need to look into the constitutional change as well, not only just looking at what could be in the future, but systematically what are the implementative processes that we have to go through. And Professor Hayashi, I really enjoyed your last 2 points on inheritable society. That I think is the crux of green growth, but it brings a more humanistic sensibility to it, that we need to make the greenness and equality and justice in order for our society to be able to be inherited by the next generation, which is very, very humanizing, and I loved it so much. As for Professor Apiwat, I mean, we've been working together for so long, and this project is one project that I've been really actually excited to hear more about it and read more about it. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time for you to respond to both Ajahn Pasuk and Professor Hayashi. So we'll just need to end our discussion and the book talk now at the present moment. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. And hopefully we will be able to sort of see each other in person sometimes in the future. So thank you again, and hope you have a good evening for Professor Hayashi, and good afternoon for the rest of us. Thank you so much. สวัสดีค่ะ
สวัสดีครับ Thank you very much ครับ both Ajahn Pasuk and Hayashi Sensei. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.